philosopher and artist Adrian Piper, who is racially mixed but light enough to be mistaken as white, contends that, quote, among politically committed and enlightened whites, the inability to acknowledge African ancestry is the last outpost of racism. It is the litmus test that separates those who have the courage of their convictions from those who merely subscribe to them, end quote. Bliss Broyard has the courage of her convictions. The daughter of the writer and New York Times book critic Anatole Broyard, she grew up with a feeling that there was something about her family that she didn't know. What was lacking was any real sense of the history of the father she adored or any contact with his relatives apart from a dimly remembered visit of her paternal grandmother and her aunt. Even in the last weeks of his life, the secret her father had kept from her and her brother, Todd, was one he could not bear to reveal himself. It was their mother who finally told him, "Your father's part black." The year was 1990. Profound changes in attitudes about race in America had occurred since their father left home, a black man, in World War II and entered the Army as a white man. And yet, how much has changed in the way we identify as black and white? 15 years ago, sociologist Lise Funderburg pointed out that, and I quote, "A paradox of the one-drop rule is that it's never a two-way street. One can be black and have white ancestry, even to the point of having a white parent. But one cannot be white and have black ancestry." That too may be changing. What am I was the initial question Bliss Broyard began asking herself as she reflected on what her new knowledge of her father's racial ancestry meant for her identity and her sense of self. To answer that question, she had to better understand the choice her father had made. To understand that choice, she researched her family history, the history of New Orleans Creole society, and along the way, racism and race relations in America. She interviewed her father's friends and acquaintances, met with many new Broyard relatives, some who identified as biracial, others who identified as white, still others who identified as black. What emerged from years of research and writing is the book, One Drop, My Father's Hidden Life, A Story of Race and Family Secrets, a memoir and family history that I think reads like a novel. This is not surprising since Bliss Broyard began her own writing career in 1999 with a collection of short stories, My Father Dancing. She has a great ear for dialogue, a sharp eye for telling details, and a compelling need to tell the unvarnished truth. And right now, she's completing a new novel, Happy House. She just told me that, and I didn't know this, that One Drop won the Humanist Book of the Year award that the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities gave, and it's no wonder. Near the end of One Drop, Bliss Broyard writes, "I may never be able to answer the question, what am I? Yet the fault lies not in me, but in the question itself," end quote. As the New York Times reviewer of One Drop pointed out, her brave and uncompromising and powerful book is an important contribution toward the negation of that question. Please join me in welcoming Bliss Broyard to the stage.
Well, thank you so much, Suzanne, for that generous introduction. I hope I can live up to it now. And now she's revealed my big secret. So I hope you're comfortable because I'll try to keep you engaged. First, I'm going to talk for about 20-25 minutes with showing some slides, and then read a short passage, about 10 minutes from the book. So please do make yourself comfortable. And then we'll have, if you have any appetite for it left, some time for question and answers. Okay. Can you all hear me all right? All right. Let me raise this a little bit more. So 2 months before my father died, I was 23 years old, and my mom sat my brother Todd, myself, my dad, and me all down for a family meeting, which was very atypical. We never had one before. and said that there was something from my father's childhood that we needed to know, a secret. In some ways, it was even more painful for my father than the cancer that had begun to eat through his bones. But my dad refused to say what it was. My mom had kind of sprung it on him. He was feeling particularly badly that day. And he said that he needed to think about how to present things. I remember exactly what he said because it was so him. He said that he wanted to order his vulnerabilities so they didn't get magnified during a discussion, which was very erudite. He was a New York Times, he was the book critic, as Suzanne mentioned, for many years for the New York Times. Very controlled, which was also very him, but kind of a strange thing to say to your own kids. You know, I need to order my vulnerabilities so they don't get magnified during a discussion. So we agreed to meet a few weeks later, but unfortunately before that date arrived, my dad was back in the hospital and his illness had taken a turn for the worst. And the next time we were all together was around his hospital bed during this horrible afternoon where he was just having these terrible waves of pain that had him struggling to sit up and screaming out, you know, help me, someone help me, as if he was kind of drowning in it. And the only thing we could do was finally get the nurses to knock him out with morphine. And then my mom, my brother, and I all went outside, Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston, Massachusetts. My mom said, I think I better tell you what the secret is. Your father's part black. That's it? You know, we'd known for a couple of weeks, and we thought, you know, he witnessed a murder as a kid, or there was incest in his family, or, you know, so this was like, oh, well, no big deal. So we asked a few questions. You know, first of all, well, how black is he? He didn't look particularly black, and neither did his mother, my grandmother, who I did meet once, as Suzanne mentioned it, and his sister. My mom explained that both of my father's parents were Creoles from New Orleans, where there had been a lot of race mixing. But that the family, when they had moved up to Brooklyn, actually a neighborhood that was first called Stuyvesant Heights, but then became Bed-Stuy. Perhaps some of you remember Bed-Stuy from the news in the 80s and 90s. It had been a rather bad ghetto, although now, of course, it's on the upswing again, the way these things work. But they had moved there in 1927 as part of the Great Migration, like many black families from the South. And his parents actually had to pass as white for work. And that this had confused my father about what his family was supposed to be. And that he was the lightest out of his three siblings, he had two sisters, and that they had chosen to stay in the black community. And that was one of the reasons that we never saw them. My mom said that growing up, my dad would be sort of ostracized by white kids who knew that his family was black, and then picked on by black kids because he looked white. And sometimes he would come home from school with his jacket torn, and his parents wouldn't ask what happened. And that he wanted to spare his own kids from the same kind of pain and confusion that he felt, which is one of the reasons why he didn't want to tell us. So this explained a lot, but I still had a lot of questions for my father. So just, you know, why did it have to remain a secret? Why did he make that choice in the first place? How black did he understand himself to be? And what did it mean to me? You know, I was 23 years old, almost 24. I had grown up one way for the first part of my life, and now I was finding out, in a certain sense, that my kind of background or my, you know, identity was based perhaps on false pretenses. I lived in a community in Connecticut that perhaps could be compared to the West End of Richmond. It was very privileged, very white. I hadn't known anyone growing up who was black well enough to call a friend. Some of the issues like busing or affirmative action that dominated racial politics in the 70s and 80s never came up for discussion in my house. Although 3 of the poorest black communities in the United States were within an hour's drive from where I lived, New Haven, Bridgeport, and Hartford, you know, I never thought about the people that lived there. I couldn't imagine their lives if I tried. So the little that I knew about African American culture was mostly from watching TV, from The Cosby Show and The Jeffersons. Perhaps some of you remember those shows from the 70s. Where if I'd really been paying attention, I don't know if you remember the Willises who lived next door to the Jeffersons, and George was always calling their kids zebras, because it was the interracial couple who lived next door. Actually, Alan Willis, the son, it was suggested that he moved to Paris and where he was passing for white. So in fact, it was kind of right in front of my eyes, but I missed it. But I didn't have a chance to talk to my dad further about this and ask my questions, because the next day he had to have an emergency surgery. His bladder actually had burst. That was what was causing all the pain. And he survived to live another month, but he was never lucid again, and then he died. And it was at his memorial service that I finally saw my father's aunt, my aunt, my father's sister Lorraine, for the first time in 17 years, and met his other sister Shirley, and his son Frank. And they brought the revelation of this secret to life. You know, they were black, or they were actually kind of light brown, but they identified themselves as black, and they were my father's family. So again, it prodded me to think, you know, what does this mean to me? Out of the 300 people that showed up for my father's funeral, in fact, they were the only black people there, except for one colleague from my dad's office. And a family friend who had been at the service that day later told me when he saw these 3 light-skinned black people sit down in the family row, my mother had asked them to sit with us, he had wondered to himself, oh, I didn't realize that the Broyards had so much help. So, that was the kind of mentality of this town, Fairfield, that I grew up in. It was there at my father's memorial service that the impact of his choice started to sink in. You know, he had prevented me from knowing my family, my father's sisters, my grandmother, who was alive until I was 12. My grandfather had passed away before I was born. He prevented me from knowing his history, and he had prevented them from knowing us. My Aunt Shirley, you know, they lived just an hour away in New York City, and she had kids, 2 sons, and we were their only cousins. And so they grew up being told that the reasons that they didn't see their uncle Anatole and their cousins was that we were living as white out in Connecticut, and we didn't want to know them because they were black. I often think about what kind of a message is that to give to a child? Your own family doesn't want to know you because you're black, because of the color of your skin. So I loved my father, and I really admired him, and perhaps like some kids, I even saw him as heroic. But passing as white didn't strike me as a very heroic thing to do. Now, it's important for me to say passing in kind of quotations, because to pass from one thing into another suggests that there's 2 discrete, separate categories, and that there's a clear boundary that can be crossed over. But when I started trying to understand for myself why my father had made this choice, I kept realizing that actually race in America is black and white is not so clear, it's not so simple, particularly in New Orleans, where my father's family was from. So that's where I headed, armed with my questions. Had my father's ancestors been slaves? How did the family become mixed in the first place? Was there a rape in a slave cabin? Or was there a consensual relationship? But I found in New Orleans, I encountered a narrative of African American history that was different than the one that I had learned rather briefly in my Connecticut prep school of Middle Passage, slavery, emancipation, sharecropping. I learned that the Creoles of New Orleans actually were historically mixed. They were French or Spanish, African, and then Native American. And then they descended from a group known as the Free People of Color during the antebellum. They had actually been free during slavery times. They had earned their freedom sometimes by fighting in the Revolutionary War, and they earned their freedom as a reward, or they were freed by a master upon his death or her death for years of faithful service. Or even during the Spanish period, when Louisiana was a Spanish colony, first it was a French colony and then a Spanish colony, they actually had the right to buy their own freedom with money they had earned by renting themselves out or selling wares in their precious little free time. Perhaps the most common avenue to freedom was being the child or the mistress of a white man who would sometimes breed his children or his mistress. And then soon after the Louisiana Purchase, there was an influx of refugees from Haiti, which had also been a French colony known as Saint-Domingue. And overnight, the population in New Orleans doubled. 10,000 people came in, a third of whom were also free people of color. packaging of the people from the free people of color at Saint-Domingue. So they doubled New Orleans' population, and they helped to strengthen the kind of French influence in the city, which included a much more relaxed attitude towards race relations and more mixing between black women and white men, compared to the more puritanical approach of the Americans who were arriving in droves after the Louisiana Purchase. So in my own family, the mixing of European and African traced back to this group of refugees from Saint-Domingue. Just quickly to look at my family tree up there. If you look at the upper left, the second level down, is Bliss Broyard. He was the first settler in America. He arrived from France in 1763 as a French soldier when Louisiana was still a French colony, helping to defend against the British and the Native Americans. He was white. He married a white woman. They had 11 children. He owned slaves. One of his sons was named Henry. That's the next person down. He also married a white woman and had 5 children. And that leads us to Gilbert, who was born in 1795. So he was a teenager right when this influx of women and men from Saint-Domingue arrived. So he ended up having 2 relationships with women who belonged to this population, the free women of color. But in between the 2, he married a white woman who bore him a son, one son, and that would be my great-great-grandfather, Henry. So Henry grew up with half brothers and sisters who belonged to this free people of color population. In all likelihood, they looked a lot alike. I don't have any pictures that remain of Henry, but he was a volunteer in the Union Army in the Civil War, and his records describe him as having yellow skin and brown hair. He was white, and probably that was similar in appearance to his half-siblings who were part of this free people of color population. His brothers and sisters were probably at least as educated as he was, or even more so. According to the census, he only knew how to read, whereas 80% of the free people of color could both read and write. In New Orleans, this population, they owned homes, they had carriages, some of them had rather large businesses, they published journals, they had a school where they educated their children. So they were quite a sophisticated group of people and prosperous. But as similar in appearance and culture as the free people of color might have been to the Latin French population, the law was increasingly drawing distinctions between them. The Nat Turner Slave Rebellion here in Virginia in 1831 created a big fear where 50 white people were killed in Louisiana and throughout the South that other slave rebellions would be organized. And the free people of color were seen as particularly threatening because they had organized they were the masterminds behind the slave rebellion in Haiti. So the Louisiana legislature started passing laws to restrict them. They weren't allowed to meet in large groups, so they couldn't plan a rebellion. Their coffee houses, their billiard halls, a lot of their businesses were shut down. And this kind of culminated in 1859. The legislature even passed a law saying that the free people of color could voluntarily enslave themselves and choose a master, enslave themselves for life. The alternative was being deported from the state. So the pro-slavery forces in Louisiana would argue that servitude, that enslavement, was the natural state for black people because they were so far inferior to white people. But it was actually the law that made them so. With these statutes, the Louisiana legislature and other legislatures across the South, they simultaneously constructed black identity while constricting it. So when Henry Broyard, my great-grandfather, he met a free woman of color. Her name was Pauline Bonet. Her parents were also refugees from Saint-Domingue. When they met, they probably found they had a lot in common. They began a relationship. She became pregnant, and they decided to get married. There was only one problem. Henry was white, and Pauline Bonet was black. So, of course, could whites and blacks marry in 1859 in Louisiana? No. So the way they got around that is that my great-great-grandfather started passing as black. They went, this is a little hard to read, but this is their marriage license. And on the right, you can see it says FP of C, Free People of Color. They went to a judge where they got a marriage license, They both declared themselves free people of color, so they were allowed to legally get married. They went to a church across town, a new church, where they weren't probably well known, not where they usually would worship. And so when the priest asked his question, does anyone here know of any objection to this union? Nobody knew any better, and they were able to get married. So my great-great-grandfather became a black person by who he married, by where he lived in New Orleans, by identifying himself that way. So his identity was not a biological fact about him, it was something that he had constructed. Their second child born was my great-grandfather, Paul. He was born in 1856, the same year that the Republican Party was organized in opposition to the expansion of slavery in the western part of the country. And of course, the Republican Party was the party of Abraham Lincoln. It wasn't the party of black people back then. My great-grandfather, Paul, he grew up in the heyday of rights for African Americans. During the victory in the Civil War on the Union side, the passage of the Reconstruction Acts that ended slavery, that gave the right to vote, and equal due process in front of the law. In Louisiana, blacks and whites could even legally get married. And at the end of Henry, his father's life, my great-great-grandfather Henry went back to declaring himself as white, because now it was legal for their marriage. But by the time Paul's son, my grandfather, was born in 1889, Reconstruction was over, and the white Democrats were starting to repeal all the rights that had been won for African Americans. My great-grandfather Paul, he became active in the Republican Party and threw his support behind a court case that was designed to test the constitutionality of a recent law in Louisiana, the separate car law that required blacks and whites to sit in separate parts of the train. And they elected a man from the Creole community named Homer Plessy, who was Plessy versus Ferguson, who was a shoemaker. He declared himself, he said, according to him, he was 1/8 black, which meant that he looked white enough to sit in the white part of the train, but he was black enough to be arrested. So actually, this was a case that was set up by the Creoles of New Orleans to test the constitutionality of this law, and they hoped that it would go to the Supreme Court and it would get overthrown. Of course, we know now that it backfired, the plan backfired. And the Supreme Court upheld that if you can have separate car trains, so long as they're equal facilities. But as we know, Jim Crow didn't result in equal facilities. The white sections of the movie theater, the beach, the train were always nicer. The other result of the Jim Crow era was having to actually legally define who was black and who was white. You can't separate people if you don't define them. So throughout the South, one of the most common ways of defining was one drop. And actually the legal case in Louisiana that established it happened to be my father's second cousin. The way they worded it there was one traceable ancestor. So if you went back in your family tree and they could find 8 generations, 9 generations back, one black person, then you were considered legally black. And then you were maybe 256 or something. So in learning about the effects of slavery and Jim Crow and then the way that race was defined in Louisiana, for me, these kind of what had seemed like abstract events and things you just read about in history books became very personal. And I saw that how they helped to shape my own history had, this quite forceful hand in shaping my own destiny. Had encouraged my grandparents, my father's parents, to leave Louisiana to try to get away from the Jim Crow era restrictions and move north. But life wasn't much easier, they found, up there. That's Edna and Nat, my grandparents. When they arrived in 1927, as I mentioned, that they actually had to pass for white for work. I was surprised to learn that in Brooklyn, my aunt had to pass for white to iron clothes in a laundromat. My grandfather had to pass for white to join the Carpenters Union. But the Carpenters Union in New York City didn't allow blacks until 1959. So, I had thought that of Jim Crow and sort of overt discrimination as being more contained in the South, but it was quite apparent in New York as well. My father told a friend that soon after they arrived, this is my dad and his two sisters in Brooklyn, that his parents sat them down in the living room and said, from now on, you're going to have to be white. And that this had confused my dad about what he was supposed to be. And his birth certificate said quite clearly that he is colored, C-O-L, in Louisiana. Of course, according to the one-drop rule, that would be true. But when my dad actually, when it came to him identifying himself, the answer wasn't as quite as apparent. When he was 17, he went to the Office of the Social Security Administration to apply for a Social Security card. And this is really one of the first times that I could find him identifying what he was. So at question 12, color, there's 3 possible choices: white, Negro, and other. There's a check next to, it looks to me like there had been a check next to Negro, and then it's crossed out. Then another check to white, and then other, there's a C. So does the C stand for colored, Creole? I don't have any way of knowing. It looks to me like you can see that there's another hand that wrote a few things, like the word none, and there's a check there, male, that looks like it's written in another hand, slightly thicker pen. And I wanted to take it to a handwriting expert, to see maybe somebody else had changed it, but all of our Social Security applications have been destroyed. This is just a microfilm that exists. But I spent a lot of time imagining how such a muddled response could come about. I wondered if he had to hand this in to a clerk. If a clerk had taken a look at him and said, "Why are you saying that you're black? You don't look black. Isn't race just what we see with our eyes? Put down white." Or if my father had decided, in that moment, why should I volunteer? I'm not going to accept an identity that in 1937, when he filled this out, was seen as far inferior than to a white identity. Should I accept the limitations that would be put on a black person? I think that he continued to justify his choice after he moved to Greenwich Village after college, which was a sort of center of bohemianism in the 1940s, where many, many people kind of ran away to escaping their past and their families, and where a person was defined more by what they thought, how they talked, their taste in literature, art, movies, women, the way they danced, the way they wore their clothes. And there he found himself among a like-minded community of other intellectuals, other people who liked to read books. And he found thought that the only person, as far as I can understand his thinking, that who had authority over himself was him. So in this way, I think he justified his decision to leave his family and his past behind. He told his sister that he decided not to be black because he didn't want to have to be a black writer. And I think he was right about that. When Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man came out, it was lauded as this incredible book about the human condition, but when it was reviewed in the New York Times, there was the qualifier that it was the best book by a Negro writer. And my father would have had to be a black writer, given the way that he was raised, with being told that he has to be white by his parents. I'm not sure he would have known about writing about black life or black culture any better than sort of being a white writer. That identity in a certain way would have been as constructed as the white one. But the problem with my father's choice for me is that he didn't live in a vacuum, and that he made the decision for my brother and me. On my birth certificate, it says that my father is white, which was not true. And he prevented us from knowing the truth, and from knowing his family, and from knowing our history. And I think that if he truly intellectually didn't believe in the value of these racial labels and their impact on a person's life, then why lie about it? Why write white on my birth certificate rather than black? I think that he changed it because he knew that the world did, and still does, measure things such as race. Of course, it determines the way that people's lives unfold. There's a quote that I thought about a lot while writing One Drop from Antonio Gramsci, who's an Italian political theorist. And he said that history has deposited in me an infinity of traces without leaving an inventory. I'll say it again. History has deposited in me an infinity of traces without leaving an inventory. And he suggests that we have to understand the social and political forces, that these infinity of traces that have gone into making us, before we can understand how to move forward as a society and what our responsibility is as citizens. And I've been thinking how with the election of Obama, perhaps we can, as a country, reckon with all the aspects of the American story, with all the traces that have gone into our history, while perhaps moving towards this ideal of a post-racial society that's been thrown around a lot in the press. Which means to me, and this is an ideal, and perhaps some people think it's naive, but a place where there isn't a sense of hierarchy between races, that one identity is better than another. And also that our concerns and our values and our desires aren't defined sort of by a default position of whether we're Asian or Jewish or gay or straight or black or white, but by more broad coalitions. I know for myself, I've learned to embrace all aspects of my background. And now that I'm a mother, I hope that my daughter will have the same experience, that she'll just grow up knowing all of her cousins. This is from a family reunion we had this past summer. So her identity won't be an intellectual exercise or require a lifelong journey or a journey of 7 years like I have, but it will just be what she knows. And I'm just going to read a couple of pages about my mother had begun to press my father in the 1980s to tell my brother and me when we were in our kind of late teen years. And she felt that we had a right to know, both for ourselves and for the sake of our children. But my father would immediately grow angry whenever she brought up the subject. To end the conversation, he would agree to tell us one day, but we didn't need to know yet. When was the right time, though? When we were so secure in our white identities that the revelation wouldn't change our conception of ourselves? When the world no longer made distinctions between black and white? When we stumbled on the secret by accident? If he'd ever actually tried to imagine our reactions, he might have been scared. Perhaps he'd done such a good job raising us as white that we'd be upset or angry. Maybe the wall he'd erected between our lives and the colored world of his childhood would prove so high that we would lose sight of him across the divide. Equally troubling might be the possibility that we'd embrace our father's background. To his mind, if we started to identify as black, then all the advantages that he'd worked so hard to provide us and everything he'd sacrificed along the way could prove for naught. Through the force of his personality, my father had managed to thwart any racial stereotypes being pinned on him by people who knew about his identity. But he couldn't be sure that we'd have the same sureness of character to deflect the distorting influence of prejudice. My father might have wondered how springing this news on us would be any different from what his father had done to him as a kid. He knew firsthand how confusing it could be to grow up thinking of yourself as one thing, only to be told you're another. His father had also been trying to make a better life for his family, but he'd hijacked his children's sense of themselves in the process. My Aunt Lorraine suggested to my mother that she'd never married because of the mixed messages she'd received as a child about her racial identity. Could my father expect us to keep his secret for him? Would forcing us into becoming his co-conspirators be any better than withholding the truth? My father could have come up with a million excuses about why he shouldn't tell us. Perhaps the simplest explanation is that he was afraid that we'd be disappointed in him. He might have gone on postponing forever, but then he got sick and his time ran out. In a talk about having a critical illness that my father gave at the University of Chicago Medical School 6 months before his death, he mentioned the need to develop a style for finishing up one's life. He'd always viewed a person's style as the literal embodiment of his personality. For him, style extended far beyond fashion to include how a person moved, the language he used to express himself, the angle of his observations. In his view, we could deliberately cultivate these aspects of our character by paying very close attention to our instinctual likes and dislikes, our innate prejudices when responding to the world. As if we were each uniquely made instruments, our job in life was to continually tune ourselves, tightening this and loosening that, until we hit upon our most natural, most authentic sound. My dad often spoke of life as a rhythmic process. When I was happy, my rhythms, my timing were good, and when I was unhappy, I didn't have any rhythm at all. Finding his unique sound allowed him to dance. In finishing up his life, my father adopted a style that defied and disparaged his illness. When his oncologist suggested that the most effective remedy for prostate cancer was an orchiectomy, removal of the testicles, my father told him that losing his balls might depress him, and that depression could kill him quicker than cancer. He entertained us with stories about his hospital roommate, a thug who'd broken his jaw during a bar fight. After having a catheter removed, my father couldn't make it to the bathroom in time and peed all over the floor. And this man, who had drawn blood in anger, leaped up on his bed and began dousing the room in air freshener. Just as my father had counted on his style to protect him from the diminishment of self that came from being black in the 1930s, he expected it to safeguard him against the diminishment of self that accompanied having a fatal illness. Rather than wasting away, he would become a crystallized version of Anatole, more insistently himself than ever before. As cancer disfigured his body and disoriented his mind, this tactic would keep him in love with himself, which was crucial to maintaining his will to live. And it would allow his family and his friends to continue loving him as he became more and more unrecognizable. If my father told my brother and me about his racial background, how could he have remained himself while also revealing that he wasn't who he seemed to be? Even if he convinced us that his few drops of black blood didn't mean that he was black, would we nonetheless feel alienated by the drops of secrecy and conclude that he'd become a stranger? In the final months of his life, my father agreed to see a family therapist with my mother. They'd been fighting a lot because my father wouldn't go along with the macrobiotic diets and vitamin cures that my mother wanted to try now that they'd exhausted the treatments available through Western medicine. In the session, my father tried to explain to my mother that he was in too much physical pain to tolerate the taxing side effects of these alternative cures. When the therapist asked him about the other moments of pain in his life that went unrecognized, my father began talking about his childhood and broke down sobbing. He described feeling caught between two worlds and how much he blamed blacks for acting in a way that invited prejudice. And he talked about being beaten up because of his white looks and black identity and how his parents had pretended not to notice. And he railed against his father, dead now for 40 years, for protecting him neither from these bullies nor the turmoil of growing up in this racial limbo. In 3 decades of marriage, my mother had never heard her husband talk about his childhood or internal strife about his racial identity with such honesty or anguish. She was deeply saddened to learn that he'd been carrying around this burden by himself for all this time. Both she and the therapist suggested that sharing this pain with people who loved him could ease his suffering. Telling my brother and me would not only help us to understand him better, but it might make my father feel less alone at the end of his life. I remember visiting my parents at their house after that therapy session. My father took up what had become his constant position in recent weeks, reclined on his side on the couch in the living room. But as he lay there with his head propped in his hand, he held forth with such enthusiasm that I could almost view him as simply relaxing. He spoke optimistically about the efficacy of the alternative treatments and how he would give them another try. He mentioned writing projects that he was eager to finish and all the work that he could still get done. And he raved about this magician of a therapist who had accomplished in a single session what 40 years of analysis had not. I feel as if I've been completely recalibrated, he said to me, without explaining what he meant, like a brand new man. In the therapist's office, my father had glimpsed a way to reveal himself without betraying who he was or changing the way that his children saw him. But at that family meeting with Todd and me a few weeks later, the right words failed to come. In my father's dream about being on trial for an unspecified crime, that I talked about earlier, he made a speech in his defense that was so moving that even in his sleep he could feel himself tingling with it. The style in which he lived his life was a conviction that he felt in his bones. But even though my brother and I were made from those same bones and blood and flesh, he couldn't be sure that we'd share his feelings about the rightness of what he'd done. And as he grew more sick, the frailty of his spirit couldn't tolerate anything short of transcendence.